Leaders and citizens of the world, this is your COVID wake up call. It is 100 seconds to midnight. This was the warning scientists gave on 27th of January this year while announcing the 2021 Doomsday Clock, which is now positioned at 100 seconds to midnight, the closest it has ever been. The group behind the clock says that it is more concerned about accelerating nuclear weapon programs, worsening climate change, in addition to the likelihood of more pandemics.
The pandemic serves as a historic wake-up call, a vivid illustration that national governments and the international organizations are unprepared to manage complex and dangerous challenges like those of nuclear weapons and climate change, which currently pose existential threats to humanity.
But what is the Doomsday Clock? And what does the phrase, "it is 100 seconds to midnight," mean for us? And how does that convey the need for climate action? This is Dinesh from Logic Detector, and in this episode, we will have the answers for the same. What is the Doomsday Clock? The Doomsday Clock is a visual symbol that intends to highlight the threats to humanity and how close is the world to a possible apocalypse. The clock was created in 1947 by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which is a non-profit organization founded in 1945 by Albert Einstein and students from the University of Chicago. Just like a normal analog clock, it has two hands and a clock face from 9 to 12. However, it does not have a second hand and features 4 dots to represent the minutes. The closer the minute hand is to 12 o'clock, commonly referred to as midnight, the more are the chances for a man-made disaster. And in case of global actions that actually prevent such disaster, the minute hand is set away from 12 o'clock to indicate improvements and encourage more such actions. How does it work? A team of scientists, namely the Science and Security Board, together with the Bulletin's board of sponsors, which includes more than a dozen Nobel laureates, meet twice a year to discuss global events in depth. The clock's minute hand position is then set accordingly once every year to highlight the intensity of events or crises happening across the world. Some of the most recent and common examples of the same include climate change and nuclear weapon development. Contrary to what one may assume, it is not adjusted in real time as events occur and rather responds to key events in a year. This can be better explained by how the clock has worked for some years. In 1947, when the clock was first founded, it was originally set at 7 minutes from midnight. Later in 1949, the clock moved closer to 3 minutes to midnight, when the US president told the American people that the Soviet Union had successfully tested their first nuclear device. Even though the Soviets denied the allegations, the arms race began throughout the world. Fast forward to 1991, after a series of setbacks and reliefs, the clock was pushed back to 17 minutes from midnight, the furthest it would ever go, as the Cold War had just ended. And now in 2021, the clock stays at 100 seconds from midnight, a little less than 2 minutes, following the COVID-19 pandemic and the unwillingness of leaders to work on the Paris Agreement goals. The meaning of 100 seconds to midnight. The Doomsday Clock is at a position same as that of January 2020 at 100 seconds. This position is the closest ever to the symbolic doom the midnight stands for. As some reasons that can reduce our ability to prevent future threats, the organization behind the clock stated the unpreparedness and unwillingness of countries to handle global emergencies and the disregard for science and spreading of conspiracy theories often by politicians and leaders.
It's a rigged election. It's the only way we're going to lose.
Climate change and the 100 seconds. The signs of global warming continue to intensify and become more evident than ever. And while factors such as disinformation, pandemics, and nuclear weaponry influence the clock's position, climate crisis by far remains the greatest contributing reason. 2020 tied with 2016 for being the warmest year on record, despite a 7% drop in fossil fuel burning. And while 2016 had experienced El Nino, a natural climate event that raises temperatures, 2020 saw no such climatic events, and the temperatures should have been ideally lower. CO2 concentration, as per the UK Met Office, is expected to cross 417 ppm, short for parts per million, in 2021 for several weeks from April to June. This is 50% higher than the 278 ppm recorded in the late 18th century when industrial activity began. CO2 concentration is a factor that indicates the presence of carbon dioxide, which is a heat-trapping greenhouse gas in the air. The lower the figure is, the better. And although carbon emissions did fall by 17% in early 2020, largely due to the shutdown induced by the pandemic, global carbon emissions in December 2020 were 2.1% higher compared to that of December 2019's. Contrary to the popular belief, carbon dioxide emissions had actually reached a record high in 2020 by its end instead of falling. The average surface temperature across the planet in 2020 was 1.25 degrees Celsius, higher than the pre-industrial standard of 1850 to 1900, dangerously close to the 1.5 degrees Celsius target set by the world nations in the Paris Agreement. 1.5 degrees Celsius is the temperature we have to keep global warming under to prevent climate crisis from becoming irreversible. The intent is to avoid crossing our carbon budget limits, that is, the maximum amount of greenhouse gases our atmosphere can hold. On this target, the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, had stated a few years ago that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would require rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented, that is, never seen before changes in all aspects of the society. It also added global net human cost emissions of carbon dioxide would need to fall by at least 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero around 2050. The parties of the Paris Agreement, aiming to cut down global carbon emissions, were still found to be investing more often in fossil fuel projects. The trillions of dollars in stimulus programs that countries have launched are not particularly green. In total, the G20 countries, a group of some countries, and the European Union had committed approximately $240 billion to stimulus spending that supports fossil fuel energy by the end of 2020 compared to the $160 billion allotted for clean energy. That is $80 billion spent more towards fossil fuel-based energy coming in the backdrop of the Paris Agreement. As per estimates, we have less than 7 years to prevent climate crisis from becoming irreversible by keeping global warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius. This has prompted environmental movement Fridays for Future to launch a hashtag Fight for 1.5 campaign in 2020. The campaign focused on highlighting the importance of the Paris Agreement along with the permanent goal of creating awareness on the climate emergency. You can track the exact time to become carbon neutral down to the very seconds with the link in this episode's description. The group behind the Doomsday Clock says that there are reasons to hope in 2021, including US President Joe Biden's plans to aggressively combat climate change. But it also requested world leaders to do more than just cut carbon emissions and eliminate the threat of nuclear weapons for good. Scope of action. As per the organization, the clock can be pushed away from midnight with active initiatives for decarbonization along with strict limits on nuclear weapons and fighting disinformation. Almost all issues demand the urgent attention of world leaders who need to use their capability and influence to bring crisis under control and safeguard humanity. Take into account Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates' word from a 2015 TED Talk.
If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war. Not missiles, but microbes. Now, part of the reason for this is that we've invested a huge amount in nuclear deterrence, but we've actually invested very little in a system to stop an epidemic. We're not ready for the next epidemic.
In an interview, he had also said every year climate change would be a death toll even greater than we have had in this pandemic.
I feel like humans have an issue, though, with fighting the last battle, potentially. So if we focus on pandemics now, and there isn't one, say, for another 100 years, what is the next disaster? What is the one that we're not prepared for?
Well, I'd point out two. One is climate change. Every year that would be a death toll even greater than we've had in this pandemic. Also related to pandemics is something people don't like to talk about much, which is bioterrorism, that somebody who wants to cause damage could engineer a virus. And so that means the cost, the chance of running into this is more than just the naturally caused epidemics like the current one.
At an individual level, one can raise voice against projects that threaten our well-being at any level, be it local or global, with the side note being the need for immediate systemic change to complement and encourage individual ones. As this show's host, I request you to check out the sources behind each bit of information you consume. One can begin doing so with our episode description too, which mentions all the articles in the making of this episode. Every bit helps.